Hey, Boris.
What's up, team?
Both the U.S. Navy and the Soviet fleet went out hunting for the Red October in the movie we watched for today's episode. But really, what are they doing about the military threat posed by the November rain? I mean, have you seen the rows of guns on that thing?
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear security for a living. And I'm in Las Vegas this weekend, so no Gabe. He is recovering from a trip from the North Korean, South Korean demilitarized zone. And that sounds like a joke, but he literally just got back from a tour of the joint security area, and we'll have to have him share some of those stories when he's back on the podcast. But I'm not just some lonely soul wandering around Las Vegas by myself like Nicolas Cage in Leaving Las Vegas. I'm here with my friend Boris, an old classmate of mine from D.C. who now enjoys the life and weather of the Bay Area. Boris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's great to be on this. Huge fan, obviously, and this will be an amazing episode of the show because I'm on it.
Excellent. Well, I know we gave you a shout out on our Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull episode. You did a little Russian language spot checking for me, so I appreciate that. So we're happy to have you here in person. In a way, you could say that you hunted me down and insisted that we watch the 1990 movie The Hunt for Red October, a story about a disenchanted Soviet nuclear submarine commander looking to make a connection with an up-and-coming CIA operative. If they can just avoid being hunted by the U.S. and Russian navies, they might just learn to trust each other, exchange some gifts, and finally go on that long talked-about fishing trip. Boris, you insisted upon this movie. What was your impetus for this? Is this a movie you've enjoyed?
Absolutely. I've been a huge fan of Tom Clancy now for several decades, let's say, and I do think that this is probably the best screen adaptation of Tom Clancy's book that was done to date.
Well, they got a good team of people working on it. From the director, John McTiernan, who did pretty good movies like Die Hard, Beverly Hills Cop 2, Predator, Last Action Hero. They got a good team of people on this, including some of the big actors in this movie. Not only the big two, Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan and Sean Connery as Marco Remus.
Marco Remus, yeah.
Yep. I'm going to call him Conrad Connery throughout the rest of this. Other than that, they have a ton of really good supporting cast people, like Scott Glenn, one of my favorite actors. He's another one of the things we covered on this podcast, The Leftovers. He plays a central character in that TV show. But then you got Darth Vader in this. You got James Earl Jones, all this good stuff. So it's a pretty good team, and it's also written by Donald Stewart. Has partially helped on the screenplay, and he wrote some of your other movies you talked about, like Tom Clancy book adaptations, like Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger. But you like The Hunt for Red October better than any of those?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is probably the best Baldwin, the best post-Bond Connery. So yeah, you definitely get some of the giants of the big screen in there. But in some of the more meaty roles where they get to chew the scenery, so to speak, and are successful at it.
Yeah, well,
and obviously there are also additional actors to what you mentioned, such as Sam Neill is on it, so Mr. Jurassic Park himself, as well as Tim Curry makes an appearance, and I do apologize for not remembering her name, the woman who plays Beverly Crusher in Star Trek: The Next Generation. She does play the wife of Jack Ryan in this movie as well.
Okay. Well, yeah, she's in the movie for like a split second.
I did some research and I found out that there were a lot more scenes filmed with her, and they all were left on the cutting room floor before the movie got its release. So unfortunately, yeah, that's sometimes that's the way it happens.
Well, the director, according to the special features I watched on the DVD that I rented out from the library, he said that he was really worried about adapting this particular book because there's a lot of content. It's a pretty long book. There's a lot of detail. I guess these Tom Clancy books, they're just filled with little details here and there. He'll take pages and pages to describe like a paperclip and where they got the paperclip and what the paperclip could be used for. It's kind of like the way George R. R. Martin describes food in the Game of Thrones books. So he was worried about adapting that. So I'm personally worried about adapting the movie into a hopefully not a 3-hour podcast here. But as you mentioned, you liked this particular movie. I don't think you're alone in this. Rotten Tomato gives it an 86% rating. Roger Ebert liked it. He gave it 3.5 out of 4 stars, called it a skillful, efficient film that involves us in the clever and deceptive game. And on a $30 million budget, this thing pulled in $200 million worldwide. Back in 1990, when this movie came out, that's a lot of money.
That is indeed a lot of money. So that's I think that speaks to the high artistic aura that this movie displayed.
Well, let's get into this here. Let's run through the plot. And as we're recording in not our usual podcast studio, we're recording in a Las Vegas hotel room. Let's make this a little more casual, similar to the Ladybug episode from a couple episodes back. We're going to call these the nuclear fireside chat style. So we're going to casually kind of talk about the plot. We'll inject some nuke stuff into it here. And then we'll kind of ease into our rating system and things at the end. So people that haven't seen The Hunt for Red October, that haven't read the book, this thing came out in 1990. You should probably get around to eventually seeing this. But spoiler warning, we're going to get into the plot here pretty deep. So let's dive in, shall we? Submarine pun.
Aha, Tim. Good one.
So the movie starts with some opening narration text on the screen as the camera kind of goes across this like war game style map of the world. And it says November 1984, shortly before Gorbachev came to power, a Typhoon-class Soviet sub surfaced just south of the Grand Banks near Nova Scotia, then sank in deep water, apparently suffering a radiation problem. Unconfirmed reports indicated that some of the crew were rescued, but according to reported statements of both Soviet and American governments, nothing of what you are about to see ever happened. That's a pretty good way of starting us off here, but
very mysterious.
What is going on?
Yeah, very mysterious, and plus those large caps, green letters on a black screen. That's that's something.
You know you're in for something here.
Absolutely.
So what do we open on? We open on Sean Connery's eyes, cold and hard. He's on top of a submarine, traveling above the surface near a Soviet sub-base.
Yep, and above the Arctic Circle. So some of you may know Murmansk, the large Russian port city in the far north. That's where the Gulf Stream actually ends, where it begins from the Gulf of Mexico. So that it's, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but let's say I'm 95% sure that it is the port that's farthest north in the world that is open year round, so it never ices over.
Well, that makes sense that Sean Connery's cold and hard character would be traveling against the current.
Oh, yes.
That's what he seems to be doing in
Indeed.
this movie. This is a particularly dangerous time for submarines when they leave their bases, especially. We're going to have a different couple names here. They talk about these in the movie like the people watching it don't really know anything about submarines, which is probably very reasonable. But they refer to things like boomer submarines, attack submarines. The two big categories here, boomers are the ones with the nuclear-armed missiles. They're the ones whose primary mission, go underwater. When they get the order to launch, get above water, put their missiles into the air.
And they're the ones that go boom, right?
The big ones, yes, exactly. Then there's attack submarines. Those are faster. Sometimes they're a little bit smaller. They usually have more torpedoes and arsenals and things like that. They go after other submarines, and they also protect the boomers as they're leaving their base. So it's a very vulnerable time because the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the Russians today, we're always tracking each other's submarines. We want to know where they are. If they leave a base, we're watching that base with satellites. We're watching that base with attack submarines in the area. So it's a very dangerous time. So usually these submarines, when they go on patrol, sometimes they'll go out late at night when it's darker. They'll go in stormy weather so that satellites and other submarines can't track them. Usually they're accompanied by patrol escorts, minesweepers, and the occasional anti-submarine helicopter just to see what else is in the area, and they try to avoid them. But particularly out of that base, unfortunately for constraints of geography, this base you have to travel a very particular path before you can get out into open ocean. And usually right when you get to open ocean, there's a U.S. attack sub or two, not really waiting to attack, but just like, hey, we know where you are.
Yep.
So that's one thing kind of as this movie starts, you have to be careful. If you're the Russians, there's someone going to be waiting for you on the other end.
Yeah, and that's just as you very astutely pointed out, due to the constraints of the Russian geography, there are only a few ports in Russia that were equipped to be a real large-scale submarine base, right? You have Murmansk in the north. There were some bases in the Far East near Vladivostok and Nakhodka. And then, obviously, the port at Kronstadt near St. Petersburg, where the Baltic Fleet and the Baltic Fleet subs were located. And those were basically the U.S. had the advantage in that it could park a few subs off of each port rotate them on and off, and that would have basically an advantage over the Russians in tracking the subs from the get-go.
And we'll see that later on. The USS Dallas attacks pretty much picks them up right as they get out of the port. But we don't get there yet. We enter, I guess, the private personal study of Alec Baldwin's character, Dr. Jack Ryan, who is a CIA analyst. In a couple of the different movies, it's unclear if it's like a James Bond thing where they don't build on each other, but this is the adventure of James Bond at any particular moment. Some of the different movies have different origin stories, like Sum of All Fears. He's like a very fresh CIA agent. He wrote a report about this one Russian politician who then ended up being president, and that's why he gets brought up to the big league. Here, he just seems to be in London, reading books about naval history, and writing stories about naval history, and he sees some sort of pictures as a CIA analyst. I guess he can take these things home with him. He doesn't have to read them in a secure facility or anything. And you can see his likes and dislikes from his early scenes here. He likes collecting toy boats and books on naval history. He likes wearing turtlenecks, and he likes mansplaining turbulence to a flight attendant when he gets on an airplane, which leads into his dislikes. He really hates flying. He does not like turbulence, and he doesn't like leaving his daughter Sally in London without telling her a bedtime story. So that kind of gives you a sense. He's this mix of, he's a nice guy in a way because he's a good father. He wants to be around with his kid, but he's also kind of a jerk sometimes because he mansplains what turbulence is to a flight attendant who just kind of rolls her eyes.
Every 80s action hero there is.
Exactly. So he gets on an airplane because he sees something in the satellite imagery, and he gets on an overnight flight to the CIA and explains to Deputy CIA Director James Earl Jones why he got on a plane, and it was because British intelligence spotted the Red October, this really fancy, state-of-the-art, latest, what they call Typhoon-class submarine. The Russians in this movie often describe the submarine as the Typhoon class. That's a NATO designation.
Exactly.
They probably don't call it that. They have other names for it. It's called Project 941.
Yeah, for Russians, that was actually named the Akula class. Akula in Russian is shark. That, by the way, is not to be confused with the NATO Akula class designation. Not the same thing. The NATO Akula class designation for Russian subs, I believe, was for attack subs. Also in the 80s, produced in the 80s, early 90s. For that, the Russians called them, I think, combination of letters and numbers, and I believe they were called Shuka class. And those are in Russian, Shuka means pike. So
pike, okay.
Yep, like the fish, pike. So what we can infer from that is that Russians love their fish, and also that Russians love their fish with large teeth. So
fair enough.
That's some high-level analysis for you folks.
What's really confused the Russians when we start calling our submarines like Ohio and Virginia. They're like, no, name them after some sort of aquatic beast with large fangs.
Exactly, yeah.
So this submarine is a big deal because it's a big SOB, as it's described in the movie. It's 3 meters wider, 12 meters longer than the previous Typhoon submarines. It's bigger than even the ones that are in our real-life world. So it's kind of a big deal. And you may ask yourself, hey, it's a submarine. Why is bigger better? Usually you would imagine quieter better. I looked this up. I got this cool book called Strategic Weapons. It's a 1988 book, so it's kind of fun. Even though it's dated, intel-wise, it's a good description of when this book was written, kind of what the sense was for these submarines. It's written by Max Vollmer. He noted that the missiles on the Typhoon were moved to the front of the fin or the conning tower. Most of those tend to be behind the conning tower, and they moved all of them up to the front. And the idea was either it was because the propulsion machinery for such a huge vessel was so large and heavy that it needed to be near the stern, so it needed a lot more room for it to operate. Some people also thought it was because this type of submarine was used in breaking through icebergs and underwater parts of the Arctic travel, so you would need things positioned and you need the ship to be a little bit bigger. But anyways, the U.S. and NATO in the 1980s freaked out about how big the Typhoon class was compared to their own submarines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Red October in the movie is named that way because of the October Revolution of 1917. That's how it's described.
Which, by the way, happened in November, but was called the October Revolution because Russia was at that time still on the Julian calendar, which means that everything is essentially 2 weeks back. So just like the Russian Orthodox Church celebrates Christmas on January 7th, I believe.
Okay.
Instead of the Western style December 25th. That's there's your answer. So that's so great. October Revolution did not happen in October.
So really, the U.S. should be calling this the Red November, just to to mess with them for their
absolutely, yeah. Code name it the Red November, and see how that designation ends up, just like with Akulas.
Exactly. So this captain of this new ship, the Red October, this guy is a big deal. I'm going to call him, like I said, I'm going to call him Comrade Connery.
I think let's go with Comrade Connery because I have no idea how to pronounce his name either. So, yeah, Comrade Connery would be good.
I know they say it in the movie, but I just got so stuck in my head with Comrade Connery. So, this is a big guy. He is like one of the best captains in Russian naval history. So, it's a big deal that he's on this ship. And the CIA, though, wants to know, based on these pictures, what are these doors on the side of the submarine? They don't know what it's for. These aren't screen doors on a submarine. These are something fancier. They want to figure out what it is. So he asked for permission, Jack Ryan, to go talk to this guy, Skip Taylor, who works out in Maryland at a shipyard, a naval shipyard. So he asked for permission, and I guess just to go show this intel, because he's a former naval guy himself. Now we're going to go back to what we mentioned earlier, the USS Dallas, this attack submarine, Los Angeles class. So it's a very advanced for its time submarine, and it's right outside of the Red October.
And in fact, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it still is. It's still the mainstay of the U.S. Submarine fleet.
Yeah, so they're getting closer to some new boomers, closer in the sense of the kind of where it was a couple years ago. But yeah, I think the Los Angeles class submarine, the attack versions are still state of the art.
Right. Yeah, I believe there's at least 2,000 or 3,000 still in service. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot more of those than boomers.
Yeah.
You hear these great conversations between the sonar operator tech, Jonesy. They call him Jonesy. I think his name is Jones, but we're going to call him Jonesy. And then he's training this kind of fresh out of the academy radar technician or sonar technician. This guy seems like he doesn't know at all what he's doing, and Jonesy is kind of giving some explanation, some exposition for us about what's going on. But all of a sudden, he says he detects a boomer out of the barn, and then describes it immediately as a nuclear submarine missile boat out of Polyarny?
Polyarny, yep.
Like you mentioned, boomer equals nuclear missile submarine in contrast to an attack sub like the Dallas. A barn is a submarine base, so the fact that he says boomer out of the barn, a missile submarine out of this particular base, is kind of redundant. It's like if I were to say to you, let's go get breakfast outside, the thing you eat with scrambled eggs and then not inside. Redundant, but it's helpful for the less supercritical of the audiences that are out there.
Yeah, alas, they did not release a special edition version of the cut of the movie for the wonks.
Yeah,
so,
that'd be good.
Alas, that'd be great. Yeah, I mean, I'd pay good money for that. Paramount, if you're listening, just keep it in mind.
Yeah, I mean, you'll at least have 2 copies here.
Exactly, yeah. You have a ready-made audience.
So back on the Red October, we switch from, at the time, I don't know how you would grade the Russian accents from Connery and everyone else, but at some point here, they're translating the Comrade Connery is in his personal quarters, and there's the political officer from the Communist Party on board, whose name is Putin, Ivan Putin, but still, they're having a little conversation, and Putin is quoting from, I guess, a Bible that used to belong to Connery's wife, who recently had passed away. And he's translating from the book of Revelations, or quoting from underlying passages. And when they get to the word Armageddon, which I guess is the same in both Russian and English, it just switches into English. So for the rest of the movie, until near the end, everything now is back in English. How do you feel about that decision?
I think it was a pretty good decision, just in terms of getting people to understand what is going on the screen. Also, Comrade Connery, as we keep referring to him, let's say that his Russian tutor probably tore out some of the hair during those lessons. So And the same with Sam Neill. So
they don't try for an accent really too much in this movie.
No, nor should they really. But because Comrade Connery's presence by himself on the screen, I think, is enough.
I mean, he's got the beard for it.
He definitely has the beard, even though at that time, I don't know about now, but at that time, the Soviet Navy, it was forbidden to have facial hair.
Exactly. So it's one of those, this is what we think someone in Russia on a submarine would look like, but...
Someone who wanted to resemble Comrade Connery.
Exactly.
That's what they would
look
look
like. Well, Connery
like.
almost didn't do this movie because he was sent the script, and his agent didn't give him the cover page of when the movie was supposed to be taking place. And this movie came out in a period of détente. The U.S. and the Soviet Union had a lot of trouble in the Cold War, but this was a time we thought, hey, things are getting a little bit better. There's a little bit more cooperative threat reduction. There's some more kind of transparency efforts, a lot more conversation and dialogue. So Connery saw this movie, and as the statesman that he was, said, this is going to inflame and destroy détente. So I can't possibly do this movie, because he thought it was meant to take place at the exact same time when this was happening. And then the director, I think, said, oh, no. It's in the past. It's like 10 years ago. And then Connery said, oh, okay, great. I was going to take what he called a golf holiday in Scotland. He wasn't going to do any movies. And he said, okay, fine. Now I'll do it.
And that's what gave us this masterpiece.
Exactly.
So we all have to thank Comrade Connery's change of heart.
Yep. I appreciate his statesman-like attitude towards what movies he picks.
Right. Yep.
Now I have to go back and look at all the movies he did and what maybe he helped or didn't help in international affairs. Because he certainly was happy.
That's a dissertation waiting for someone.
Well,
if you're listening to,
he was certainly willing as 007 to go out and attacking the Soviets on any number of occasions and stopping their plans and stuff. But
that was also in the 60s, and there were also some beautiful women involved. So who knows with Comrade Connery.
Understood. Well, so Connery he's talking about this Bible and the passages, and I guess there was a quote that is written on the side from the famous Robert Oppenheimer, where he references the Hindu Bible. I don't know if it's sacrilegious to write Hindu Bible passages in a regular, maybe Russian Orthodox Bible. He wrote down on the side what Dr. Oppenheimer said after seeing the Trinity nuclear test, the first nuclear test. I have become death, the destroyer of worlds, which is not something that the political officer is too happy about the captain of a nuclear boomer saying, because it seems like maybe he's not interested in his job. He's underlining passages about the end of the world. Connery makes this, I think, a pretty funny joke where he says this was an American who said that, and he was later accused of being a communist, which is exactly what ended up happening. Right as Oppenheimer was getting pretty close to retiring, due to him being described as a communist by his political enemies, he was stripped of his security clearance. It was a big series of public hearings about this, and pretty embarrassing for the guy, because largely he was part of the reason they did that was because he didn't necessarily have a change of heart, but he was trying to say, now that the World War II is over, let's try to calm relationships. Maybe don't build a thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb. But the political officer doesn't think that joke's funny. So Sean Connery...
Political officers never do.
Well, Sean Connery, after reading the orders that he was given by a Strategic Submarine Forces commander, which told them basically, you're going to go rendezvous with this other Captain Tupolev, Tupolev, who was a student of Connery back in the day and a hard man. They were going to run some drills, and they were going to hunt the Red October, which is the name of the movie, and they were going to see how good the submarine was. Well, the political officer didn't laugh at Connery's joke, so what does Connery do?
He basically strangles him.
Yeah, kind of cracks his neck, strangles him, and then pretends like the guy tripped on some tea, and he passed away, and he then takes the real orders, burns them, and replaces them with his fake orders. At this point, we're not really sure what's going on here.
Yeah.
He either could be trying to steal the submarine, trying to do a rogue attack. I don't know. We don't really know what it is just yet.
All we know is that he has a command of the submarine, and no one else to countermand the orders.
He's the man now, dog, you could say. So Jack Ryan, we go back to the shipyard in Maryland. He's there with this guy, Skip Taylor, who's adding a rescue sub to another sub. So I guess, remember that, it's like Chekhov's rescue sub. You see it at some point in later on in the movie, and Tyler notices the doors. Jack Ryan asks what they are for. They're too big for torpedoes. He referenced what's called twin screws, which is submarine lingo for the propellers. Jack kind of asks the question: could be for horizontally launching ICBMs, and probably what it is what they call a caterpillar drive. I don't know if this is a real term of art or it's just one they made up for the movie, but it's some kind of magnet hydrodynamic drive propulsion thingy that is the equivalent of silent but really like jet engine fast propulsion system. They says that it gets to the point where if this is working, the propulsion system will sound like whales. Like it could know differences between the submarine and background noise.
Yep, basically. So submarine runs silent. Submarine has 30 SLBMs, and yeah, that's
pretty dangerous stuff.
Very dangerous.
Well, Skip's like, hey, they can come right up to the coast of the United States and launch everything, and we wouldn't even know what they were there. And he talks about the story of his dad having him dig a fallout bunker in their backyard during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the stage, I guess, that we're set for here. But we're going back to the Red October. And what happens on the Red October? We have a Tim Curry sighting.
We have Tim Curry sighting. No fishnet leggings involved here. However,
we don't know what's under his uniform.
Well, yes, I never know. That's part of the mystery. So the obviously the scene here is that they are trying to figure out whatever happened to the political officer, Mr. Ivan Putin, and Comrade Connery obviously says that he slipped on some tea, died, the poor sap, and that as the holder of the second missile key, Comrade Connery should now take the other key and keep it to himself as the chief battle officer, commanding officer on the station. And Comrade Curry, which is a very weird thing to say, but let's call him Comrade Curry. Because the ship's doctor.
Comrade Curry is my favorite type of curry. It's very delicious.
Exactly, yeah. Very blistering and very rather hot red. Comrade Curry tries to basically tell Comrade Connery that perhaps he should keep the second key and so as to keep the launch authority command with two separate people, but Comrade Connery is having none of it.
In this world, it is similar to what I think a lot of people think about when they think of how do nuclear weapons go off. And a lot of people they've heard of the two-man rule. You see that in movies like War Games, where there has to be two people separated by a certain distance. They both turn a key at the same time. That way one person can't do it. Mm-hmm. So I guess according to this logic in the movie, there's a political officer and there's a military officer, and they both have launch keys, and they both have to turn the keys either for it to go off or to get codes or something. Yep. It's funny in this world that there isn't a procedure for what happens when the political officer is incapacitated, whether it's because of an injury to their neck or maybe they just have constipation from eating too much Comrade Curry or something, that there isn't like an order of operations, like a line of succession. You would imagine there would be something like that. Like this isn't a problem that they haven't thought of yet.
Process analysis is a very deep field, so maybe the Russians at that time just didn't get around to it. However, the other thing that I wanted to point out is that this is not the sole portrayal of such a system. I believe in 007 GoldenEye, there was a similar system, for launching launching Petya, the satellite. So I think that's just a fascination that maybe American Hollywood screenwriters have with the way that Russian launch code systems work. What is the truth? What is the truth?
Let's do what we normally do on this podcast, which is take very good movies sometimes and nitpick the heck out of them.
Oh, yes.
So this is total movie nonsense, based on what I think at the time they were mirroring the U.S. system and the public's understanding of how these weapons would actually be used and what the process would be. So this is the real history of our world, not the Hunt for Red October world. So starting in the early 1970s, according to Pavel Podvig, who is a brilliant analyst for the Russian strategic nuclear forces, according to his book, which I'll quote at the end of this episode, he says that the authorization codes needed for a submarine's missile control and guidance systems began to be transmitted in those early 1970s period with the launch order over lines of communication with the strategic missile-armed submarine. The strategic weapon control and guidance system thus became more centralized. To interpret that into kind of common lingo, there is no key. You get the launch codes and the unblocking codes, the codes you would need to actually fire the weapons. those are transmitted to the submarine from the launch authority, whether it be the political government or the military, the general staff.
So from outside
the submarine. Someone on the submarine can't fire them until they receive those codes themselves, which is very different than the U.S. system, where there's still codes and authorization and things like that, but you'd have to... the key system at least kind of opens up and starts the process there.
So the Soviet submarines basically starting in the 1970s could not go rogue per se.
Exactly.
In that, I assume that they would be able to fire torpedoes and the non-strategic weapons at will, but for the boomers, the SLBMs, inaccessible unless they receive the electronic transmittal of those codes.
Exactly. And this is rooted inherently within how the Russian command at the time saw what they wanted to be the separation between the local commanders and then the political military leadership at the top. So according to another great book with a great title, The Logic of Accidental Nuclear War, by a former ICBM launch officer, Bruce Blair, in contrast to the U.S. system, the, quote, overriding aim of the Soviet command and control system was preserving firm operational control from the center while ruling out aberrant actions and ensuring that the top of the nuclear command and control system retained reliable negative control, and at the lower level echelons of the hierarchy lacked the means to assert positive launch control. Negative launch control, this is me again, negative launch control is people that shouldn't launch, can't launch. Positive control, people that can launch when they're told to. So that's kind of the way system here. It's hard to have a combination of those two things, because if the people that need to launch can't, they have to be given authority from, say, up the president. If you take out the president, they no longer have the ability to launch. So in a crisis, do you give those people who actually have the weapons pre-delegated authority? According to all of this, the Russian system didn't have a version of this during the Cold War. A message to the submarine would be transmitted over low, high, and very low radio frequencies, would issue either two commands or a combined message, issuing first the permission to use the weapons, and then second, a direct command of where and when to launch the weapons, and those would contain unlock codes and a launch code word. And all those would be the things that they would need to physically launch. Usually these two codes were issued, one from the General Staff of the Armed Forces. For the submarines, Chief of Staff of the Navy, the CINC, would issue this.
So, Tim, what would you say this tells us about sort of the overall civilian or military control over these weapon systems in the two countries, comparatively speaking?
Well, I think it definitely signals a sense of insecurity from the leadership, the top Soviet leadership, about kind of what all the various people within their military on the lower level, the people who actually have the fingers on the button and that can launch things. I think there was a concern that orders wouldn't be received correctly. There was a sense of wanting to control, as you would imagine, to centrally plan not only the economy, but also the military activities itself. And I don't think it also reflects a little bit of, this is hard to tell at the time of the Cold War. There was always a sense in the United States that the Soviets were just about wanting to, the only thing holding them back from invading conventionally into Western Europe or starting a first strike of a nuclear conflict was the overriding presence of the United States and its ability to maybe respond quickly. I don't think that necessarily was as strong. There were a lot of problems within the Soviet Union that we didn't learn about until after the Cold War, of missile commands and the readiness of the military. So I think the larger concern for them was an accidental launch, an unauthorized launch, and that priority was higher than pre-delegating things for flexibility and speed later on for the actual sub-commanders themselves. So I think that's kind of, the biggest overriding theme of these two, especially in contrast to the United States. But this code that would be issued to the submarine commanders, I think it's kind of fun what the messages were nicknamed. For the Navy, it was called the Wave. For the missile wing, it was called the Signal. And for the Air Force, it was called a Wing. So if you received a wing, a signal, or a wave, you know that something's about to start. That's pretty dangerous. So even before this procedure started in the 1970s, the launch codes were kept in the personal safe of the commanding officer of the submarine. Two people were needed to authenticate the orders received from the general staff to launch their weapons. And this is somewhat interesting. It's the commanding officer, so like Comrade Connery, and then the deputy commanding officer. So not necessarily the political officer. I think it depended at the time. But those were just to essentially, those two people would need to authenticate the message.
Right.
But it doesn't have anything to do with a key or anything like that. But here's the thing. There was a political officer on board. I'll give the movie and Tom Clancy, the author of the book, the benefit of the doubt, because the Soviet Union liked to tell people that their submarines could launch on their own, so don't even try to attack us, because our submarines can just do this. They used to release a lot of stuff to the Western press about what they could do. A Soviet general even told another U.S. official when they said, "Oh yeah, so we've got keys on our submarine. That's how this works." And the Soviet commander's like, "Yeah, we got that too." It's exactly the same thing.
So what you're saying is that fake news was alive and well during that time.
Like Russian fake news and everything. But the evidence is pretty strong that a key might have been needed to operate the firing control system to like turn it on. But there were multiple codes needed to be received from the outside of the submarine. And there's a lot of evidence you can kind of delve into. This is one of those things where I'm okay with giving them the benefit of the doubt, because the authors and the screenwriters at the time, they were mirroring what they thought was true of the U.S. and kind of what they heard in the press, but it wasn't necessarily how it worked. So the important thing to know is that's what we thought at the time, but we know better now, right?
Oh, there could be a lot of people who could be let off the hook on that one.
All right, so Comrade Connery, let's get back to the plot. He's addressing the Red October crew, and he gives this great monologue, right? Do you want to...
Yeah, I'll try to do Comrade Connery accent. I don't think I'm quite able to pull it off, but let's roll with it. Once more, we play our dangerous game, a game of chess against our adversary, the American Navy.
For 40 years, your fathers before you and your older brothers played this game and played it well. But today, the game is different. We have the advantage.
It reminds me of the heady days of Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin, when the world trembled at the sound of our rockets. Only will tremble again at the sound of our silence. The order is, engage the silent drive.
Aye, sir. Balance control.
I love that. So according to his fake mission, that he tells to everybody, they're going to conduct missile drills off the coast of the United States, off the coast of a major U.S. city, and then they're going to go to Havana for a day in the sun. Not a bad billet, right, for somebody?
Yeah, and then you can hear definitely the sailors cheering when the captain says that, and
singing.
Yeah, and singing the Soviet and the Soviet national anthem, and that Soviet national anthem is now the Russian national anthem, albeit without the words. So. Anyway, so as we can all see from that, whatever goes around comes around.
So let's cut back to the USS Dallas, who's been tracking the Red October. They're right behind him. They're like, "Wow, this is a big sucker," but we got him. We're following him. It's our job. They engage the Caterpillar propulsion system, and the Red October just vanishes
From the sonar.
From the sonar.
Yeah.
And Jonesy's like, "Wait, let me reset everything. I'll try to figure out what's going on here." But it just kind of like disappears. He says he thinks he can hear singing in the submarine, which is a little nonsensical. Not really.
Yeah,
we don't have that ability.
Not yet. Or at least it's not...
It's classified.
Yes.
The Red October just disappears, and we don't really know what's going on there. I think I'd like to inject a little bit of interesting real-life spy stuff into this here. So I know you heard of this story before, but John Walker... It's one of the biggest cases of espionage in U.S. history, in particular one of the worst cases for the U.S. Navy. John Walker had a really long career in the U.S. Navy. He had one of the top clearances. He served on a nuclear-armed submarine. He was actually even part of a patrol when they did what's called Starfish Prime. It's a code for a big nuclear test where they tested at high altitude and essentially in space. But at some point he became disenchanted with the Navy. He ran into some money problems. In 1967, he took some photocopies of some classified information. He drove from Norfolk, Virginia, up to Washington, D.C., and I've done that drive a lot. It's a long drive.
Drive to the pine forests on the peninsula. And then,
And he basically walked right into the Soviet embassy and said, "Hey, I've got some documents. I want to make some money. Let's make it happen."
What do the Soviets do, knowing that they are But that at that time, leadership was kind of conspiratorial and just not really trusting. They think that, oh, hey, that's
it's a spy here.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to figure out who within the embassy is undercover as a KGB operative. But apparently, he somehow, I don't know exactly how, but he convinced them of his.
It just happened to be that there was someone in the Soviet embassy who was a naval nut and had a lot of knowledge and would track this stuff, and he looked at the documents and he said, these look legit. They brought it back and they analyzed a little bit more of it, and I gave him a down payment, $2,000 or something, to hold on to. The big thing is, twice a year over 18 years, he would go to a drop-off point and drop off documents, just essentially in a soda can, in this abandoned little area. He would drop off film that he would take photos. The Russians gave him this fancy little micro camera thing, and he would take photos of all kinds of documents, military codes. He was involved a lot with crypto messages and things like that. He would also.
So he had access to some pretty sensitive
good
information.
A lot of older stuff, but still some really good stuff. That I think the Russians said, don't give us anything new, because then your cover is going to be blown. But give us some recent stuff, and our people can figure out what's going on here. He recruited some others, including his son, to help him out. Eventually, he left the military. He left the Navy, and then thought he could do more work spying as a contractor for the Navy and things like that. He eventually got caught when his ex-wife turned him in to the FBI, because he was so much enjoying his spy life. He was very neglected at home. But one of the most important things that he leaked was how the U.S. Navy at the time was able to very, very well track pretty much every Soviet submarine due to a particular feature of their propellers that weren't built correctly. They were producing a signature sound by the baffles, which is, you'll hear this in the movie too, when a propeller spins, it produces a sound and bubbles and waves and stuff. They were noticing a signature that they could detect for miles and miles and miles and miles on these Soviet submarines through their hydroacoustic, the U.S. hydroacoustic water detection system. So they noticed this, and then when the Soviets found out, hey, all of your submarines are being tracked, and here's why, they went out to try to fix that. And it got to the point where Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger said that through this process, the Soviet Union made significant gains in naval warfare attributable to that spy ring, access to weapons and sensor data and naval tactics, terrorist threats, surface, submarine, and airborne training, readiness, and tactics. So it's a pretty big loss. And this led the Soviet Union to go out and get better equipment to make quieter propellers.
Now, I think this happened in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, correct? So John Walker was called in the early 80s, right?
Right.
Give or take. So
yeah, he started in 67, and he worked for about 18 years before he was caught.
So this is not the Typhoon class that we're talking about. We're talking about the previous class of the Soviet submarines.
Yeah, but this, I think you can say that the story here is somewhat based off of kind of what it would be like if we can't track the submarines anymore. One of the things I deal with a lot of work are export control rules. If you want to export something from the United States or one of our partner countries to somewhere else, you're supposed to have export controls. Is the person that you are sending this to the right person that's actually going to receive it? So maybe you're North Korea and you want a particular type of machine technology, but it's banned because it could also be used to make weapons that are banned. Whether they're nuclear or conventional weapons, you try to hide that. You say, oh, no, it's a company in Singapore that's going to get it. And then it gets shipped to Singapore.
And then re-exported. Yep.
Right. Or anything like that. It's two companies, one which we know very close, Toshiba, a Japanese-based company, and then another company in Norway that I can't pronounce. I won't even try. They bypassed their government's export control system because they were being directed by their shareholders to increase profits and export sales. They shipped this precision CNC machinery to essentially model and shape and create propellers. They shipped that stuff over to the Soviet Union, which enabled them, now that they knew what the problem were, they got technology and blueprints on how to make better propellers, and created a quieter submarine. The U.S. government was furious. A Senator, Jake Garn, said, quote, "We really need to hurt Toshiba, go out there and cause some tariffs or something. We have to punish Toshiba for what they did."
And that was in the 80s when U.S. and Japan oftentimes were at loggerheads over trade policy as well. So obviously that played into it.
Exactly. But here's where the problem is. All this stuff is real. It's all based in some real life situations. But the movie exaggerates how important the propulsion system is for a quiet submarine. It's incredibly important. A lot of the noise that's produced by submarine is based on the propulsion system, whether or not you have a caterpillar-like system that's quiet, or if you have, screws, propellers. It's only one of several factors. A lot of the times when people are a sonar technician and you're looking for sounds, you listen to the reactor making noises, because there's some nuclear reactors are a lot quieter way quieter than a diesel submarine.
But there's still vibration produced, right? And that vibration transmits into the water surrounding the submarine, and that can be tracked.
Exactly. We do things like the hull, the outside of the submarine, you can coat it with some sound-absorbing material, some kind of like rubber tile. That's another thing that people do to make their submarines quieter. This is something I didn't know a lot about. I'm still trying to read more about this, but there's floating decks, isolated decks, so that it's not one single piece that can creak and make noises. They are individual pieces that overall are pretty quiet. They absorb sound. Those are one of many factors that are important about a submarine. You can run at 0 and don't move with no propulsion system, but if other things are running, you can still be detected, especially how close the Red October was to the USS Dallas. They were saying it's like 4,000 yards. According to one source I read, that's like a knife fight range for how close submarines can get. So they would have heard something. But then you wouldn't have a movie, right?
Gotta keep up the suspense.
Exactly. All right, so let's go back to the Red October. We have this cool visual effects shot, and I love the visual effects for this movie. It's all done with little props, like scale models, essentially. And it couldn't film it underwater because that doesn't look good. You can't really photograph that well.
Yeah, so because you won't see anything, right?
Exactly. That's how submarines work, right? But what they did instead was had like smoke. So everything that looks like water, it's essentially is smoke, and then they added a few little bit of post-effect stuff. But here's what the submarine looks like. You mentioned earlier it's got 30 SLBM submarine launch ballistic missile doors, these launch tubes. Normally, the actual Typhoon has 20 in real life. This one is even bigger than that. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. I'm going to pull out my calculator and see if the math would work out of having 10 additional SLBMs based on how big they say it is compared to the existing Typhoon class. And the math checks out. So congratulations to Tom Clancy on this. Exactly. So here's how it works. So the Red October has 30 SLBM doors and is 12 meters longer than the real-life version, which held 20 of these RSM-52 SLBMs. That extra 12 meters would allow for 10 more launch tubes, or 2 rows of 15 in total, because each missile is 2.4 meters long. So those extra 12 meters equates to exactly the amount of distance you would need to add the 10 additional SLBMs. And the extra 3 meters on either side of this larger weapon is also exactly the type of size you would need. So I don't know why, but that's a fascinating little detail that they include in the movie. So I don't know if that comes from Tom Clancy or if it comes from Stewart, who wrote the movie. But either way, I was like getting ready to pounce on a nitpick, and I said, "Oh, I will cede this round to you, sir."
Right. All of the naval advisors and the Pentagon advisors that were used by the production company during the movie, they come in handy.
That helps
sometimes. Yep.
All right. So how about you direct us through what happens next?
Sure. So the next part is we are in the command headquarters of the Soviet Navy in Moscow, I presume, where a stodgy old admiral walks into his office through a bunch of doors where everyone greets him, and he's like, yeah.
Another day at the office.
Yep. Exactly. He gets his morning tea from the orderly, I guess. Right there, and the tea is obviously in one of those Russian cups that I remember well from my childhood, where you have like essentially a glass where you pour the hot liquid in, and then that glass actually gets put into the pewter or metal ring ensconced in it, and you drink out of that. So that's a very nice detail. I thought that was very appropriate. And
honestly, I didn't even pick that up, but I'm going to go back and look at that scene. Yeah. That's great.
He's not drinking it out of a normal cup.
Like a savage.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a Western savage.
Like a Westerner, yeah. Like a bourgeois.
But did he put his pinky out? I couldn't tell.
No, I don't think so, but maybe. But at the same time, he's opening his day's correspondence, and amongst that, he finds a letter from Marco Ramius, aka Comrade Connery, telling we do not know what is in that letter, right? They
Not
don't
yet,
even.
but it's basically the plans. He's like, hey, FYI, I
Right.
stole a submarine and
Yep,
I'm going
so-
to do something with it.
Yep. So we just show him reading it. We don't see the contents of the letter, and then all of a sudden we see the glass fall down, and then it cuts right straight to the next scene.
Yep.
So a couple of things on that really quickly.
What you got?
In real life, I would imagine that any sort of mail correspondence would probably be read over both before it reached the admiral's desk by his adjutant or assistant, as well as probably by the Interior Ministry operative when it was sent over from the sub
Fair enough.
captain's desk. So although it makes for a great movie scene, it's not necessarily how it would happen in real life, and probably the plan might have unraveled even before.
Well, I would just love to have seen him opening up a bunch of his personal mail. It's like, all right, here's a bill. All right, here's my phone bill. Another ad for 20% off for Bed Bath & Beyond. I got enough of those.
Exactly. Yep.
And then all of a sudden he finds that little letter. But anyways, the point is, Comrade Connery can't keep a secret, which I think the rest of his crew is pretty upset about.
Yep.
As well. Like, why can't you just keep your mouth shut?
Although he did keep that secret from them until they were already at sea. So
Before we sailed, I dispatched a letter to Admiral Bedorin, in which I announced our intention to defect.
In the name of God, why?
When he reached the New World, Cortez burned his ships. As a result, his men were well motivated.
You have signed our death warrants.
Bedorin will send the entire fleet.
Jesus, they'll find us. They'll find us and hunt us
Nobody's
down.
going to find us. That's enough, Yuri.
You had to do it, huh? You couldn't just turn the submarine over to the Americans. You had to make a political statement. Was it ego, Captain?
We each have our reasons, Victor. Huh? My own began the day I was handed the blueprints for this ship. A ship which had but one use.
So Jack Ryan, he's in this hallway. He's doing a little like West Wing walk and talk with James Earl Jones, and we find out he's about to brief the National Security Advisor. He's pretty nervous. In his presentation, I could not stop thinking of his great monologue he has, Alec Baldwin in Glengarry Glen Ross. His presentation's not nearly as good as that.
No.
But you can see a little bit of the swagger as
The
he
guy's
briefs.
not getting the steak knife set.
No, not at all.
A, B, C. A always B, B, C closing. Always be closing. Always be closing.
He goes through the brief, and here's what he says. He says the Red October, it's a big sub. Its displacement, which is how much water it moves, kind of tells you the size of the submarine. Jack Ryan says it's 32,000 tons in the water, and that's a pretty big submarine. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. The real-life Typhoon, it has 34 to 48,000, depending on the size model it is, submerged. So it's already the largest submarine ever, compared to, say, the Ohio-class U.S. submarine, which is about 17,000 tons of displacement. So the fact when they say this is a bigger Typhoon-class submarine, it's actually smaller.
Right. Yep.
So then they lose a point for me. I don't know why they do
Yeah,
that.
so two things. One, I think the actual dimensions and the tonnage of the Typhoon class was definitely classified on the Soviet side, and I doubt that it was available at that time publicly. But also the second thing is I think that gets to the overall sort of design of how Russians designed the Typhoon class submarines, because I believe they had why it displaced so much more than comparable in terms of delivery. The Ohio class submarine was because I think it was built on a double hull. With a double hull, i.e., there was an outer hull. Below the outer hull were the actual SLBM launching system, and then below that was I believe the other interior hull where all of the crewmen and all of the communications and whatnot was. So that's why the submarine was the way it's not that it was basically a design concept for that. It wasn't Let's put in as much steel or aluminum as possible and just get a big boat. There was a design concept behind it.
It's a real big deal, but I think the big thing that he says in his briefing is that the U.S., because of this Caterpillar propulsion system, they wouldn't be able to detect it with the SOS US, this warning nets. And this is a real life thing. This is a system of antennas in the ocean with hydroacoustic detectors. They're deployed at the border of Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Great Britain, and elsewhere in the Pacific. An area of this, as a submarine passes through it, they can know, all right, there's a submarine coming through here. Let's start to track it. Maybe we'll send out a ASW or anti-submarine warfare airplane that will start to monitor where this is. And then this is where my supercritical hairs on my arms start to pop up, is because the National Security Advisor thinks maybe it's a first strike weapon because of how quiet it is or some sort of a thing. And Jack Ryan agrees. He says that the MIRVs, the multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles on each of these missiles, can do a lot of damage with little to no warning. And I guess that's the idea that Skip Taylor said, is that the submarine can get right off the coast and fire all the missiles really quickly and no one would even know. But I don't really understand why they would describe the Red October as a first strike weapon as opposed to what normally you would understand a submarine to be, which is a survivable second strike. All the missiles get knocked out, the land-based ones, all the bombers get knocked out. You think, great, I've first striked, I've stopped them from being able to attack me. Oh, I forgot. There are all these nuclear submarines out there. Each missile can carry 10 or so warheads. I'm still going to get hit pretty hard. So when they describe it as a submarine that has stealth and can, quote, shower its targets with MIRVs with little to no warning, that's just a textbook's definition of any sort of nuclear-armed submarine.
Right.
So I don't really understand why they describe it. Maybe because of how stealthy it is, it can get right up to the coast. That's not how this works.
So the range on the RSM-52s, I believe, is 8,000 kilometers. And so with that, I mean, that's 8,000 kilometers. That's what I think. That's more than the distance between San Francisco and New York, right? So pretty far. So the submarine does not need to be next to the coast of the enemy to launch its missiles.
Well, they talk about that. They say that the submarine will take 4 days to reach its target, because we find out here that the Russian ambassador to the United States goes and meets with the National Security Advisor and says, hey, look, we have pretty good evidence that says that Comrade Connery has stolen a submarine and is now going to go to the east coast of the United States and first strike without our authorization. So can you please do us a favor and hunt and destroy this submarine? We're going to go out and do the same thing. We're going to go after this thing. And it takes 4 days, according to the movie, for it to get to some kind of range, whatever that is. But you're right. 8,000 kilometer operational capability of how far this missile can go. And that's where we see the submarine at the very beginning of the movie to Washington, D.C. is less than 7,000 kilometers. We're talking warning distances in time of like 20 to 30 minutes. I don't understand, with little to no warning, 20 to 30 minutes. Maybe that's enough to get missiles out of the ground and up in the air, and we would still have our own submarine force to retaliate against them. This whole first strike notion, I just don't get it. And maybe there's someone can correct me in the comment section of the episode or on Twitter or something, but I just don't really understand why this would be described as a first strike weapon. But anyways, Jack Ryan is hearing this briefing and he just yells out, "You SOB," and he figures out what's going on here.
Son of a bitch!
You wish to add something to our discussion, Dr. Ryan?
Well, sir, I was just thinking that perhaps there's another possibility we might consider. Ramius might be trying to defect.
Do you mean to suggest that this man has
Proceed, Mr. Ryan.
Ramius trained most of their officer corps, which would put him in a position to select men willing to help him. And he's not Russian. He's Lithuanian by birth, raised by his paternal grandfather, a fisherman. And he has no children, no ties to leave behind. And today is the first anniversary of his wife's death.
Oh, come on. You're just an analyst. What can you possibly know what goes on in this mine?
I know Ramius, General. He's nearly a legend in the submarine community. He's been a maverick his entire career. I actually met him once at an embassy dinner.
So what does he do? He asks for a little bit of time to test this theory out. And there's this great back and forth. The general in the briefing room asks a CIA analyst how he could possibly know what Comrade Connery is thinking, which I thought was funny because that to me is like the job description.
Right.
A CIA analyst is to come up with intel and interpret the intelligence, but the National Security Advisor likes Jack's gumption and gives him a couple days to try to figure it out.
Also, the NSA thinks that Jack Ryan is "quote unquote" expendable. So
yeah,
that's,
exactly. So he can be fired if something goes wrong.
That I think is runs very true to real life. So,
although to be fair, if Jack Ryan is wrong, half of the East Coast is expendable because there'll be missiles in the air.
Exactly.
But I guess what Jack Ryan wants is he wants to get the submarine and look at it. Do some intel work. That would be amazing. But anyways, so that's kind of where we're at now. This other submarine that we talked about earlier, this one manned by
Captain Tupolev,
who's played by Skarsgård.
Stellan
Skarsgård. Awesome in this movie. He's now ordered to hunt his former professor, and he pushes the nuclear reactor to 105% of its capability so he can catch up.
What does that even mean?
I don't know. I think it's dialing the reactor to 11.
Exactly.
That's what I think that means. I mean, run it more so that it has a chance of breaking, but
right. Yeah. I mean, there's only so much fissile material, I would assume, right? So
this is outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah.
But the point is, he's going fast, right? He goes fast, boom. He goes to ludicrous speed.
Yeah, exactly.
Too many movie references here. So Jack Ryan gets permission to fly onto the USS Enterprise, which is an aircraft carrier based in the Atlantic Ocean. He meets up with Fred Thompson, former Senator Fred Thompson.
Former unsuccessful presidential candidate, Fred Thompson as well.
Former district attorney,
yes.
Fred Thompson from Law & Order. Fred Thompson's really good in this movie. He's exactly the level of Fred Thompson-ness that we've come to love. He brings up a good point that if you try to steal the boat without not all of the crew on the Red October is probably going to be part of this mutiny, right?
Yep.
So
ostensibly, they did take the oath to the Soviet Navy and to the Soviet states. Right. So some of them are probably not as.
And there's probably 100 or so crew on this particular boat. Fred Thompson asks, "Are you going to kill the ones that aren't involved in your plan? Or are we going to hold them hostage or hold them prisoner forever? What are you going to do with that crew?"
And also, how do you keep the Russians from actually finding out that you have the boat?
That would be kind of an act of war,
because, right? But because boards in a boat in peacetime that is that no one gave you permission to board it's an act of aggression, act of war, especially if that boat contains 20 SLBMs. That's problematic.
30.
Oh, 30. My mistake. I'm sorry. That's
even worse.
I'm still operating in the real world. My mistake.
So it's a big deal. Now Jack Ryan has to think about this a little bit more, and we also learn a little bit more about Jack Ryan's backstory. He's not just a book-learned CIA operative. He actually was a former Marine when he was in the Naval Academy. He was in a bad helicopter accident that left him in traction for over a year, but he still finished his schooling from the hospital bed. So we kind of learn this guy. He's got some training. He's clearly a badass in a way. He's not just some guy who sticks in his study reading books on naval history in London.
Although he does that as well.
He does that as well. He's a well-rounded guy.
Yep, Renaissance man. True Renaissance man.
And there's also this great scene where on the USS Enterprise, an incoming, I think they changed the stock footage to make it a different airplane, but an F-14 goes to land on
the deck of the carrier,
and it crashes. And Fred Thompson has this great line that says,
"This business will get out of control. It'll get out of control, and we'll be lucky to live through it."
And I think that's great because it really points to the idea of escalation without really any sort of intention. Small things can lead to things that can spiral out of control, especially when you're talking about essentially stealing a Russian first-class Typhoon-class submarine.
With nuclear weapons.
So I think that's a great thematic point here. It's a little tiny scene, but it's kind of fun. Speaking of fun little details, we go back to the USS Dallas, and I had to pause the screen here because in the middle of this conversation where Jonesy is talking to Scott Glenn, who plays the CO of the USS Dallas, he's talking about the fact that Jonesy can figure out how to detect the Red October. He's figured it out. The computer can't figure it out, but he can figure it out, and now he can track even with this Caterpillar system. In the background, you see a couple books on the CO's desk, and some of those books, Jane's Defense Weekly and what looks like Dutton's Nautical Navigation. There's no reason that they couldn't have just fake books in this background, but the fact they have these real life journals, I used to read Jane's Defense Weekly all the time for jobs back in the past. I don't know what Dane's Nautical Navigation is, Dutton's, but I looked it up, and it is a real book, like a reference guide for navigating around in a submarine. Why have those details? But I appreciate it. Props to the props department.
Yep, exactly. And once again, I think the advisors from that the production has retained, they proved their worth every penny.
So the Red October is now navigating its way to the United States, and it has to pass through what they call Thor's Twins, which is like a ravine with lots of different kind of jaggedy rocks, and has to go through it.
It's basically essentially a geological formation somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, which leads to a bunch of canyons, which, do we know, does that actually exist?
I looked this up, and someone said that there was something like it, but it's not called
Thor's. Okay.
Thor's. It's something like Jupiter, something or other, but there's some kind of an equivalent, but nothing like that. I thought Thor's Twins was a funny name. It sounded like something like a prank that Loki would play when Thor was in his bachelor days. Like turn into a snake, turn into a set of twins. And
exactly.
Anyways, it's a precarious situation. Comrade Connery pushes his team. I don't really know why. I think he's just wanting to get faster to the east coast of the United States so he can defect. He knows he's being hunted.
Yeah, I think that he's trying to change tactics because since he taught all of the current, in the movie, all of the submarine captains in the Soviet Navy, that if he changes tactics on them, then he'll be able to sort of slip past the other submarines. But I'm not really sure why.
But we end up having a little bit of an accident. Turns out someone sabotaged the Caterpillar drive. Something having to do with the cryogenic plant failed, and they're worried a little bit about radiation leakage. So I don't really know.
That to me just reads like Star Trek gobbledygook, like in the Next Generation. They're like,
but it's the important thing here is that the crew is worried about radiation leakages, and they have to switch back to regular propulsion.
So they lose the Caterpillar drive, they lose the ability to silently run.
Well, here's what I'm confused about. If there's worried about a radiation leak, is the Caterpillar drive nuclear-based? It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like it's some sort of magnets. If the reactor is broken, you can't drive on regular propulsion because that's what powers both of those two things.
Tim? I think that we're way in the weeds here, I'll be honest.
Anyway, so now the Red October is vulnerable to detection. The USS Dallas picks it up again, and they try to kind of figure out what's happening here. Now we cut to some kind of fun little chase scenes. They're trying to figure out who the saboteur is, who damaged the Caterpillar drive. We're cutting to what's called Bear Foxtrot in the movie. It's a Soviet anti-sub aircraft.
Is it the Tupolev Tu-152, or do we know the designation, or we just see just a Soviet-type bomber?
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know what it is. I just know that it's dropping sonar buoys, and they find the Red October, and they drop a torpedo. So the Red October does countermeasures, and it doesn't get hit, but it's close.
Right.
So
it hits the side of the canyon, I believe.
Does all that kind of fun stuff. So they eventually
get
away.
Lots of suspense there, yep.
Jack Ryan eventually figures out that the Soviets are chasing the Red October and are trying to push them towards the U.S. attack submarines. So he wants to get on the USS Dallas because they're tracking the Red October. They know how, and he wants to essentially just jump into the submarine so that he can tell Scott Glenn, here's what's going on, don't blow it up. Because he thinks that there's a defection, so he's trying to convince them. And it's this great line while he's on a helicopter because he doesn't like flying, where he says, "Next time, Jack, write a goddamn memo."
Yep.
He said that a couple of times. I thought that was pretty funny. Jack Ryan gets on the USS Dallas and tries to make his case to Scott Glenn about kind of, hey, look, the defection's going to take place. I don't think Scott Glenn's having too much of it
Nope.
at first. Then we cut back to the Red October. It's this kind of sad scene of Comrade Connery and Sam Neill debating about what state Sam Neill wants to live in, which he says Montana, and how many wives he wants.
Yeah, I'm not sure
What was that?
Maybe they got confused. They have it confused with Utah, circa 19th century, but who knows? It's, yeah.
Yep. We find a little bit about kind of why Connery's doing this. You learn about Connery's sad regrets. His wife passed away when he was out to sea.
Mm-hmm.
She underlined all these passages about the end of the world, trying to maybe convince him, look, what you're doing is dangerous. And once he gets the blueprints for this new submarine, he also thinks it's a first strike weapon, and he wants to not be a part of this anymore. And he just wants to be a fisherman again. Like he was, I guess his father, or when he grew up, he was involved in the fishing industry, and he just wants to get back to doing that. But now they figured out that the U.S. Dallas is behind them, because the U.S. Dallas is kind of right behind them. So they do this move called a Crazy Ivan, where they suddenly, without warning, change course.
Tim, is that something that was actually tried out in real life?
Yeah, it's a real procedure.
Wow.
Because the idea is you hide behind the baffles, the bubbles in the stream, to kind of basically hide amongst the noise. But to do it, you have to be relatively close by. So if you suddenly change direction and the USS Dallas or the attack sub that's behind them doesn't follow suit, then they'll now be able to be detected. So according to Pavel Podvig, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, his book, Russian Strategic Nuclear Forces, he lists a couple different tricks that the Soviets would use to escape detection and counter ASW. He said, Crazy Ivan, periodically changing course to verify that they're not being followed is one way to do it. You try to stay in direct proximity to like merchant ships or other naval vessels, and just kind of with high noise levels and hide amongst them. You can travel at the quietest possible speed, which actually means slower. So a lot of these combat patrols that boomers would go on, they don't go very far.
Right.
But they're just moving really quietly, really low, because they know roughly where all of these hydroacoustic antennas are. So they just kind of go real quiet. Crazy Ivan, I don't know if that term is correct, but that style is definitely a real thing.
So so in real life, though, it was more about sort of keeping yourself undetected rather than focus on speed, being in the right place as fast as possible.
Exactly. And if you know you're being followed, you can at least, all right, now I'm going to call this in, maybe have some other helicopters on your side trying to scare them away.
Call for help, basically, yeah.
Right. Exactly. All this stuff happens. Eventually, Jack Ryan convinces the USS Dallas CO to signal to Conrad Connery that they're right behind him. So let them know. Then the CO does this full reverse stop. So that because he does that, the engine's running backwards. Essentially, they produce a bunch of noise that tells the Red October that they're there. The Red October doesn't move, so that's kind of how they communicate, right? That that they're there. And then they send out one ping.
I'll be damned. Now what?
So he communicates, "Hey, are you trying to defect? Yes or no?"
Yes or no.
And then Jack Ryan tells the Red October, "If you are going to defect, go to this particular place, the Laurentian Abyssal." Kind of a very cheery name, but they plot a course for that direction. And the Red October, all of a sudden, looks like it has a reactor problem, right? Tim Curry's freaking out. There might be radiation leakages. Connery orders the submarine to surface to get air. He tells all of the crew that's not the officers. The officers are the ones involved in the mutiny. He tells them to get off the ship, get on the boats, and Connery, because he's an amazing hero, will go down with the ship.
The captain. So an interesting side note on that, and this is something that I just learned very recently. In real life, the Typhoon class was only crewed by officers. So there was there were no NCOs nor just seaman class aboard, because it was considered such a, strategic asset that, because it is a very advanced, by Soviet standards, was a very advanced piece of equipment that only trained officer personnel would be allowed on board and to operate all of that equipment.
That's interesting. I did not come across that. So this mutiny plan maybe wouldn't work
No,
so well.
but anyway, that's
Carter would have to give a really good monologue here for this to work.
I think there was no way for them to know that at that time. So that's
how would they? Yeah, how would they know that?
So and then the other part that I actually wanted to focus on for just a little while is I think the movie The Hunt for Red October. I think it was one of the first movies that really tried to get the actual life aboard a Soviet submarine in the to show it, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least in some way, shape, or form. I actually wanted to check and see what did they in terms of showing what it was like. Did it actually correspond to the real life? Unfortunately, I didn't find any first-person sources on the Russians' life aboard the Soviet submarine. However, I did come across an interesting entry from 2010 in the Russian Navy blog. Which, as far as I know, I mean the author is anonymous, but I gather he's he's an American, either a former NCO or a former officer in the U.S. Navy, so knows quite a bit about what's going on. What he did was he came across the notes that the Russians took in a joint exercise with the French Navy back in 2004. Where the two sides, during the exercise, they exchanged several liaison officers on board one another's ships. Now, mind you, these are surface ships. From the French side, they were two destroyers. One was called one was called Tourville, and the other one was called La Touche-Treville. So I don't know who they were. I think Tourville was a French admiral in the 17th century. Don't ask me how I know that, but don't know who the other guy
By the way,
is.
Boris, we used to go to do trivia a lot, like pub trivia, and Boris, it was not fair. Like the amount of knowledge that you had about nonsense things like this was always very impressive. I always felt like we were cheating.
Good to know that, and thank you for the compliment, Tim.
So, what were some of the things that they talked about in this?
So this is a very interesting memo which was translated into English from the Russian side. So one thing that the Russian liaison officers took a note of was that. Slippery deck. They were actually very surprised that the decks on French ships were covered with the rough paint, which limited slipping even when wet, which obviously happens quite a bit because you're in sea, inclement weather. In Russian ships, apparently that was not standard. That was in 2004. So
So I remember I've taken a lot of tours of naval vessels throughout my life. It's weird. Before I was a bit into this stuff, my dad used to take us to like a submarine. I did a summer debate camp between my freshman and sophomore year of high school, and we visited one out in San Francisco. And that was one of the things I remember was how gritty the floors and the walls were to give you traction. And then my uncle had a boat, and it's kind of the same thing. I remember anytime I would fall, because I fell a lot as a kid, you scrape your knees so bad on that really gritty stuff. And it scares me to think that the Russian submarines didn't have...
Yep, on the stairs, mind you.
Oh
So that's
So that's an OSHA violation right there.
Well, I'm sure the Russian OSHA would be very interested in what's going on. So another kind of thing, hygiene on board the ship. Oh boy, the Russian officers took note that the Tourville, French class destroyer, which was 30 years old at that time, so built in the 70s, there was hot and cold fresh water in all of the compartments and all of the showers all of the time. And one of the Russian officers even scribbled in the margin of the memo, "No comment," with 3 exclamation marks. So I think that's comparative, yeah.
Well, the Russians were just harder, hard winters.
Exactly, yeah. Another comparative difference that the Russian liaison officers noted was that on board of Russian ships, and I think that it's shown kind of in the movie as well, is there were lots of musters, i.e. a muster is when the entire crew has to be present and accounted for, and in some sort of a rank order. Musters apparently happened several times a day on the Russian ships. I don't know if that extended towards submarines, but on the Russian surface ships that was the case.
Like the beginning of this movie when Comrade Connery gives his
exactly.
And he starts singing.
Yep. On the French, on the Tourville, there was no crew muster for a week. So I don't know if that's. So I'm not sure what the standard is on the U.S. Navy vessels, but I assume they're probably closer to the Tourville. Less emphasis on muster and all of those things that were prevalent in the 19th century Navy.
Well, it seems like the Soviet Navy was taking it from the Michael Scott School of Conference meetings. Conference room, 5 minutes, 5 times a day. Seems like what it's like.
Yep, exactly.
That's interesting. Well, we learn a little bit about kind of how all of these machinations come about in the movie, because the big trick is revealed. So the U.S. frigate appears to signal to the Russian, the Red October, if you submerge, because they had gone up to surface level, we will destroy you. Connery orders the crew to get out into the lifeboats that aren't the ones that are mutiny. So then they submerge. Yep. The U.S. frigate drops a torpedo out of a helicopter, and it detonates 300 yards from the Red October. So it looks like to the Russians that aren't defecting that the submarine is under attack.
Yeah,
right.
Yep. The submarine was sunk. That there was a hit because I believe the torpedo that doesn't just deactivate it; it explodes.
Right. So they think it's gone down with the ship. Tim Curry, the doctor, says, "Oh, he's going to get the Order of Lenin for this because he's a national hero." But then Jack Ryan uses that mini rescue sub that we see earlier in the movie. He uses that to make contact with the Red October. I guess their systems are compatible for the rescue subs to work together like that.
I believe they make a comment to that effect earlier in the movie when Jack Ryan visits the shipyards, and they are actually working on that mini sub. And Skip makes the comment that they are working on it, and it can hook up to anything. That mini sub,
just anything. It's
exactly, yeah, even a Soviet sub. Yep.
So now the Russians are back to speaking Russian. Kind of a quick little change there, because I don't know why, but they're back to speaking Russian. This is a kind of a big scene you see multiple times in the movie. Jack Ryan declines cigarettes because he doesn't smoke, but then he asks for a cigarette as a sign of peace. He starts coughing, which takes the pressure out of the situation. And then Sean Connery says this nice line.
I present you the ballistic missile submarine Red October.
One, not only does he call it the Red October, but it sounds like it's Christmas, like they exchange gifts.
Too bad that he didn't add Buckaroo to that line of dialogue, and a word that he used earlier in the movie to describe some of the American captains.
Well, speaking of another captain, all of a sudden alarms start to go off because Captain Tupolev is here. He's here to hunt the Red October, and he's found them, and he's starting to throw some torpedoes and all this stuff. And now the crew is shorthanded because all the non-commissioned officers are off the ship. And Jack Ryan, for some reason, is tasked with steering the Red October. Don't know why Connery doesn't do that.
Not
or someone else.
Ryan, not a submarine officer. Was never in the Navy. Was in the Marines, but obviously doesn't have a first-level knowledge of how to operationalize. Yep. And also, usually, from my understanding, American submarines and Soviet and later Russian submarines are different enough that
right?
You would need at least a crash course in knowing how to operate something in another language. Yeah,
no time. No. Here's what happens. I love this little scene. The Red October steers directly at the incoming torpedo. And the way they do it is because the torpedo has a safety switch that will only arm itself after a certain distance. And the Red October closes the gap. The torpedo just hits the front of the Red October and breaks apart because it hadn't actually been armed yet.
Right. Would that actually happen in real life, do you think? I mean, I don't know. That to me sounds like something... I would imagine that there would be some sort of a collision and that there could be some impact on the submarine hull which could cause a problem.
Well, the Red October, it's
an invincible ship or an invincible boat, yeah.
It's a Typhoon class.
Exactly.
Don't underestimate it. But now there's a comment made that Captain Tupolev is going to change his tactics, right? He's going to remove the safety mechanism, so the next one is going to get them. But then we find out that the saboteur that we keep hearing about was the cook this whole time. We see him at the very beginning of the movie when the keys are exchanged, when Conrad Comrie takes the keys and he announces the new orders. He, it turns out, was actually some kind of secret
GRU agent type,
KGB style intelligence person. He was there. He knew what the orders were. He knew something was up, so he stayed behind when everyone else was getting away. And he shoots at Connery, but Sam Neill jumps in the way, and he gets shot. He never's going to make it to Montana.
Too bad.
Instead of seeing Big Sky Country, Montana, he's marching straight towards the big country in the sky.
Yep, and ends up in Jurassic Park. If you pass that, do you think overall about having essentially a firefight in the middle of or in a pressurized environment below the surface of the ocean?
Well, we learned that the saboteur does not want the submarine to fall into American hands, so he is going to go to an SLBM, a missile, and hotwire it like a car to make it explode, to essentially kill everybody and destroy the ship, I guess, to go nuclear and to blow it up. So he goes to do that, and Connery and Jack Ryan go and do a firefight. Now, this is a question that you may be asking yourself. How does a cook know about how to rewire the firing mechanism of an SLBM and cause it to detonate? Now, Joel, the former podcast host, he submitted this question to me to cover on the podcast. And
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah. Hey, Joel. Supposedly, in the book, it's revealed that the cook was an intelligence officer. They mentioned this, I think, in the conversation between Comrade Connery and Ivan Putin at the beginning, like how many KGB agents are on this ship and they don't know, and they won't talk about it. So the point is, that's who he was. In the book, it's more explicit. Here, it's a lot less explicit. According to Bruce Blair, the guy I mentioned earlier who wrote the book The Logic of Accidental Nuclear War, he interviewed a former Soviet naval officer who said that the boomers in the 1980s usually had a KGB officer on board. They tended to know who that person was, and they had no combat portfolio. They just kind of walked around and, quote, smiled and checked the crew for morale and political loyalty.
So my response to that is, for KGB, very well may be true. The cook, I believe, was or at least it's hinted at in the movie that he's GRU, military intelligence arm.
Different than a KGB.
Yes, whereas KGB was the political, or not political, but really the Interior Ministry's spine arm, so roughly equivalent to both CIA and FBI combined.
Right. We're I jump back and forth between KGB and GRU because I think the movie does.
Right,
like,
because for that it's just an acronym, whereas the GRU in real life was and still is basically military intelligence, kind of like DIA, but on DIA on steroids with a much more inclusive portfolio of activities, shall we say. So they may very well have had some training with that, but once again, suspense. Suspense is what this movie is all about. So
well, here's the question I have. It's sure, how can an intelligence officer like this know how to detonate an ICBM or an SLBM? But the question I have is, how good is this secret political officer's borscht? If they're going to make some food for the crew, I really hope for the crew's sake that he's at least a competent, multi-talented guy.
Yeah, and that's
not an easy skill.
No, I mean, the gentleman is shown as, I think he's either cutting meat or cutting something in almost every scene, so must have been working around the clock right there.
Very impressive.
Two very different portfolios, shall we say.
He's really the star of the movie, to be honest. So here's something you kind of mentioned earlier. This scene really can happen because the Typhoons, SLBMs, because of this dual hull system, pressurized hull, the SLBMs literally are not accessible to the crew. They're separated by walls of steel or titanium or other kinds of metals that the hull is made of, so you have no access to it. But Tom Clancy, he may not have known that. He was modeling off of the U.S. submarines where these things were accessible. According to Bruce Blair, there is a way on some of the submarines, not the Typhoon class, but where you could get access to it. There was a procedure to bypass unblocking codes, which are the things you would need to literally launch the weapon with the guidance system. But to do it, you had to have multiple members of the crew stationed throughout the ship doing a very particular sequence of actions, almost simultaneously, but in a particular order, for the guidance system unblocking codes to be bypassed. I would say for this movie, there weren't too many cooks
in the kitchen.
Right. So anyways, Comrade Connery takes a bullet. It's up to Jack Ryan to stealth his way through the rows of very conveniently labeled in English missiles. Let's say have the numbers, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's numbers. I mean, I think the builders of the submarine had very anticipated this very scenario happening, so they put signs in both Russian and English. And
here's the thing. Obviously, I think Jack Ryan speaks Russian and reads Russian. I think that's an understanding.
From Tom Clancy, I believe he does.
So why didn't they just say, all right, it's on the? I think he said, missile number 20 is where this is going to happen at. He can just go to the end of the hallway. They could have a line that says Missile 20 is at the end of the hall. Whatever. Doesn't matter. Thing is that these missiles are labeled in English, and they're also all red. So they really commit to this. When they call it the Red October,
it is very red. Very red.
My favorite color combination, this is an aside, is red and black. So the fact that the Typhoon's hull is black and the inside is red, I love this.
This movie was made especially for you, Tim.
Exactly. So they have a lot of gun shooting stuff. They joke that these things in this room respond well to being shot, things like missiles. Jack kills the cook right before the bomb's about to be detonated. The USS Dallas steps in to kind of divert a torpedo away. They trick the torpedo into coming right back to Captain Topolov because there's no safety mechanism on it. He dies. Instead, the crew thinks that the submarine actually detonated the Red October.
Yep.
And then you see a little bit of things at the end of the movie. The National Security Advisor for the U.S. tells the Russian ambassador that the Red October was destroyed, and it was destroyed in this deep abyss that there's no way they're going to be able to get to it.
They will not be able to recover it. And then I believe the Russian ambassador also makes a comment that they also essentially lost another submarine, and the NSA makes fun of him for that. Hey. Essentially saying, no, you lost another submarine?
Dun, 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 dun.
Yep.
We cut to the Red October. It's near Maine, off the coast of Maine, near a particular naval base. They say it's far enough away from one of those so that the satellites won't pick it up because they're actually surfaced. Because they want to have this not very good CGI, like green screen thing of Connery and Alec Baldwin having a little conversation about.
You can see the forest through, I think, someone's hair in there. So green
it's
screen
pretty
was
bad.
Definitely. I mean, the late '80s. What can you say? No.
Fair enough. But I think a little bit of a nitpick thing here is where they're at is only 85 miles from the U.S. Naval Air Station at Brunswick, Maine. And if you're going to have a satellite imagery looking at this particular naval base station, because they do a lot of ASW there, they are really not that far for satellite imagery. Might want to stay below water for a little bit longer. But they have this conversation.
There is one question you haven't asked me yet. Why? Now, there are those who believe we should attack the United States first. Settle everything in one moment. Red October was built for that purpose.
When the dust settles from this, there's going to be hell to pay in Moscow.
Perhaps. Maybe some good will come from it. A little revolution now and then is a healthy thing, don't you think?
Connery says he's looking forward to fishing again. Jack Ryan finally has a chance to sleep on the airplane ride home, so you see that his nerves have calmed. Next to him is this gigantic new teddy bear that he bought for his daughter Sally. But I'm upset by that.
Why is that, Tim?
Because why have a giant stuffed bear? That's a little too Russian for me. Should have got her a stuffed eagle.
Stuffed eagle. That's what we're missing. Toys R Us, if only you had that. If only you had that idea, maybe you'd still be in business.
Yeah. Well, anyways, that's the movie. This whole movie is a fascinating little tale. It's loosely based on a real life story of an attempted mutiny aboard the Soviet frigate. Horace, how would you pronounce this Soviet frigate?
Storozhovoy, the Guardian.
The Guardian, excellent. And they know how to name their ships. That's good stuff. So this frigate's political commissaire, Captain Sablin, wanted to steal a ship, not to defect to the United States, not because he was so upset at conflict and war. He was upset that the Brezhnev-led government in Russia was not Leninist enough, that they were corrupt. So he wanted to give a radio broadcast to the rest of the Soviet Union, calling on people to restore their revolutionary zeal.
So a couple of things if we may touch on it. First of all, we're not talking about the ship's captain here, not the battle officer.
Exactly.
We're talking about the chief political officer. So the chief political officer thinks that the current who should be the most reliable, I guess, the person on the boat on the ship thinks that the communist leadership is not orthodox enough, so need to go back to the basics. So I think that's a bit ironic. First,
it's like because in this movie, Ivan Putin gets his neck broken or strangled to death.
Right.
He, in this real life story, he's the supposed hero of the.
Right.
Anyways, so he tricks the captain. Says that there's some sort of like disciplinary problem downstairs, and then he locks him up, including And he takes all the officers and he makes them vote who's going to be in favor of this. Supposedly, he's really good at giving speeches.
As a political officer should be,
right?
No, but almost never was. Witness Putin's speeches.
Well, he gives all these speeches, and he gets most of the crew to agree. But one of the guys who voted in favor of this has doubts. He escapes. He goes and tells somebody what's happening. At first, they don't believe him, but the crew thinks that they will be caught. So they leave a day early in the middle of the night, which signals that they actually are defecting, or not defecting. It signals that they're stealing the ship. Half of the Baltic fleet thinks that this guy's about to get asylum. He's going to seek asylum in Sweden, I guess what had happened recently with another one of their captains. So they chase him. Unlike Comrade Connery, his crew is captured. The ship is captured. He is arrested, Captain Sablin, and he is tried, convicted of treason, and executed by a firing squad. So the movie's very different, but the story was written into a master's thesis and then a book, which was placed in the U.S. Naval Academy archives, later read by Tom Clancy, who was an insurance salesman at the time, and inspired his book and our movie today.
That's how it comes together. Really, really, really interesting. And I'm just surprised, how would what I assume was an academic or a wannabe academic at that time, how would they get information on what actually happened? Because I'm guessing that was still in the 70s, 80s when the flow of information was quite severely restricted between the Soviet Union and the West. I would imagine that the Soviets would not want news of an attempted takeover of a naval frigate by the crew to really disseminate very widely.
You know, your wife is trying to write her doctoral thesis at this point. I think you are underestimating the
tenacity of an
academic researcher. But
honey, love you.
One of the things I love about this is that Tom Clancy, he wrote this, and it was published by the Naval Academy Press. Much like a lot of Michael Bay movies, the Navy was very happy to let them play with their toys. The Navy thought that this movie could do for the submarine fleet what Top Gun did for their flight schools as a recruitment tool to get people involved. I think even there were some stories of like recruitment stations being set up outside the movie theater. Hey, you love this movie? You like Scott Glenn? Do you want to be Scott Glenn? That kind of stuff. I don't know if the CIA had an equivalent.
Probably not, but I'm guessing it also has to do with the sort of the post-Vietnam, sort of the idea that the U.S. military in general was sort of back on its feet and back on top. Obviously, this movie came out a year before the first Gulf War, right? It came out in 1990.
This was 1990, yeah.
Yeah, so 1 year before which gave it further push, sort of. But yeah, I think there's quite an interesting, potentially dissertation topic to be explored with regards to how those movies in the late 80s portrayed the U.S. military.
Well, it's a double-edged sword in a way for this particular tale. So in terms of accuracy, it meant that the Navy essentially had an open book for letting them learn on actual U.S. submarines. So the USS Salt Lake City opened up its doors, opened up its hatch to the crew to go on an overnight run. Scott Glenn, who is this, like I said, the CO of the USS Dallas, in
the movie.
Yep. I don't think in real life.
Yeah.
I think in real life he's just a general badass. So he shadowed the actual captain of the USS Salt Lake City, and they had an arrangement set up so that Scott Glenn would actually give the orders, and they were meant to all the crew was meant to salute him as an actual officer, and they went through all of their procedures. This guy who ran the tour eventually became like a top level person. I don't forget if it was the Secretary of the Navy, but he became a high level guy in the U.S. Navy. So that was kind of a cool little trick there. So there's that accuracy and things, but the story you mentioned to me before we started this podcast, it had a negative side as well because they ran all these missions. You want to tell this story here?
Sure. So the U.S. Navy has detailed several ships in addition to USS Salt Lake City to assist with the filming. One of them was another Los Angeles class submarine, the USS Houston.
Mm-hmm. Which is where they filmed a lot of the actual, I think, the Dallas scenes, right?
I believe it stood in for Dallas throughout the filming. I think that they filmed some of it on a lot somewhere in LA, but some of the scenes were filmed on board the submarine.
Mm-hmm.
So it was there to assist in the filming of the of the movie, right off of Long Beach and LA. Unfortunately, it for whatever reason it was involved in a collision with a tugboat during the filming. Tugboat that I don't believe was involved. It was just there in the general vicinity. What happened is the USS Houston has basically run into a tow cable that the tugboat was towing, and what happened is it snagged the tow line for the tugboat, and it essentially snapped the entire tugboat in half.
It dragged it underwater.
Yeah, dragged
too,
it
right?
under.
Yeah.
Yep. And so one crewman on the tugboat lost his life during that accident. That I was actually not aware of it until very recently, so I think that did not have a good ending.
The double-edged sword of access to actual naval military work is great for accuracy, but these are people who are operating very dangerous equipment. There are people whose lives are put on hold for a long time when they're on deployment, and it's sad when these kind of things happen in the course of the filming. So let's wrap up here. We've kind of gone through all the nuke stuff and the plot stuff. Let's do maybe some concluding thoughts on the film. You know our rating system, Boris. You're a longtime listener. Our rating system, we usually do 1 out of 5 so that it's consistent across all of the different content, whether it's movies, TVs, books, video games, board games, whatever we decide to cover today. But we like to customize it, to tailor it, so that if we're going to get super critical about the movie, we're going to get super critical about our rating system. So for today, how about 1 out of 5 pings, like sonar pings, right? In the movie, 1 single ping is good enough to send a secret message to another submarine. But if you have 5 pings, you can talk to whales.
Wow.
I think that's a pretty big deal.
Yep.
So how many out of 5 pings would you give this movie?
I'd give it the full 5.
A full 5?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
A perfect ping movie.
Yeah, the perfect ping movie. 100% ping proof. I'd say that basically the combination of Connery and Baldwin works very well, even though they're on the screen together for only a few minutes of the movie. I do think that it marked a new direction in military movies, which went for more realism than the ones before. If you look at some of the stuff that was made in the 60s or 70s, it was really kind of. It was either gritty drama-like, or else tacky explosions. Whereas this was really a suspense movie with an action thriller, sort of a large action thriller component.
That's cool. I like the way you described it, because it's, as Roger Ebert mentioned in the review that I quoted earlier, like it's a great pace of how the mystery is unfolding. That's why I talked about the actual real life story at the end, because I wanted this to be revealed slowly in the course of the podcast as well. So this whole mutiny story, I think it's a lot of fun how it's going. So I'm going to give it 4 pings. Very fun, some good action scenes. Connery's great. Watching young Alec Baldwin is a delight. The only issue that I kind of take away for 1 ping is simply nuclear related. A lot of the stuff about, and this is a thing that if I watched this movie as a young man, I would have maybe given it a 5. But now that I'm aware of kind of how the Russian naval vessels work, the idea of why this would be a danger at all in terms of it being a first strike weapon, I can't get that out of my head. As accurate as these movies are compared to some of the previous submarine movies, there's just enough that 4 is pretty good. So it knocks off 1 point off for me. 4 is still really good. It's better than average. I would recommend it to people to watch for sure. Hey, speaking of recommendations, we like to recommend some things. If you like this, be sure to check out this. Maybe Boris has got some recommendations, but I've got 3 things to recommend people to check out. First, a movie from 1958, so an oldie, called Run Silent, Run Deep. Stars Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster. There's a captain of a U.S. submarine in World War II that's sunk by a Japanese sub, and after working a desk job for a while, the captain gets a command and kind of another submarine, and goes a little like Ahab and Moby Dick. He goes on this like mission to just get revenge on this Japanese submarine captain. So there's a lot of internal conflict. So I recommend checking that out if you can get past the fact that it's a little dated in terms of racial politics and things like that, but it's probably reflective of what World War II was like. Second thing I recommend is the book I already quoted from Pavel Podvig, Russian Strategic Nuclear Forces from 2001. Terrific reference guide on the Russian military in terms of its nuclear forces, land, sea, air, all of that stuff. One of the best books on this subject. And the 3, I would recommend a book called Big Red. Not about the chewing gum. It's about 3 months on board a Trident nuclear submarine from 2011, written by Douglas C. Waller. A great tale of what it's like to live on these submarines, kind of the lifestyle, the mission, all the things that kind of go into that. I recommend that book. It's a quick read, and it's a fun one. Boris, you got anything to recommend for us?
Yeah, and I believe this will be made in the notes section of the podcast. But I do think that if you did enjoy the conversation about sort of the life aboard the Russian vessel, the series of blog posts that the Russian Navy blog did about the subject would be a great interest to you. Some really funny stuff in there, but also the stuff that you will find interesting as far as how does the overall sort of command work on a Russian surface combatant ship versus a Western surface combatant ship.
Cool, okay. Any Tom Clancy book you'd recommend? Because you like The Hunt for Red October, but do you any other?
Yeah, I guess there is a nuclear component to that as well. So if they make a movie, you can cover it as well. But The Bear and the Dragon, that would be, I think, my favorite from Clancy. But
that's where the U.S. and that's where Russia and China go to war.
Yep, exactly.
And Jack Ryan has now been promoted to president of the United States.
Yeah, promoted. Yep.
Yeah.
There's got passed into GSSES or whatever it is from the analyst position.
Is Some of All Fears a book as well?
Yes, it is a book.
Is it a good one?
You know what? I have not actually touched that in 15 to 18 years. I believe I liked it when I read it first, but
okay, quasi recommendation maybe. But definitely the Dragon and the Bear and the Dragon. Great, cool. Well, Boris, thanks for hanging out here in Las Vegas with me, and thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you coming on, and hope you had a good time.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and I love all the work that you're doing here.
Cool. Well, let's go back hang out in Vegas. I know we did a little bit of gambling, but it was mostly we went to the Mob History Museum and Hoover Dam. So let's go find out what other nerdy thing we can do in Las Vegas, right?
Absolutely. Onwards.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or want to tell us what we got wrong or whether or not you want to have Boris back on the podcast, let us know. A couple ways you can contact the show. Visit our website at supercriticalpodcast.com for links to all our episodes. There's a contact page, and there's also other resources relating to today's show. On Facebook, facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast. Hey, we're also on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast. And I check my email account, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoy the podcast, if you enjoyed any of Boris's dry wit, we'd appreciate if you went on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and give the show a subscription and a rating, possibly a 5 stars, say 5 pings. That'd be great. It would help us to grow the show. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Boris.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.